I think you approach this subject from an interesting point of view, being the editor-in-chief of Thrillist. I wrote a story earlier this year that posited that native had kind of, the buzz was kind of off of native. There was a lot of pushback coming from advertisers that wanted to see like really solid measurement numbers. Native is really hard and expensive to do. Everything is going to a distributed model, which doesn't really work well for native. Are you seeing any signs of that?
Well, look, I mean, we've been in the native game since we started 11 years ago, so we've seen it take a bunch of twists and turns, and I think what you've seen over the last couple of years is definitely the most excitement we've ever seen in that space. I actually think that the distributed model is going to be one of the reasons that native continues to advance and continues to become a really powerful advertising tool. But I think that part of it is that if you were to have bought a house 150 years ago, they probably would talk a lot about indoor plumbing. Today, you're not using it any less, but native is more mature, and I think that people are more accustomed to making it a part of your normal ad buy, and it's sort of less of a novelty.
It's table stakes.
It's table stakes.
Okay. So how's the distributed model going to be good for native?
Well, I think that when you're looking at publishing things into every place that you have an audience, you're not necessarily going to be able to rely on banners, so that's gone. So what are you going to be able to do? I mean, you as a publisher are still creating content, whether it's paid or not. So one thing that I do think we should say about the state of native right now is that it's never been more editorially strong. And so I think that editorial strength, whether it's paid or not paid content, disseminating that into all the different places that people consume content is going to make it into something that it can travel with the spread of a distributed publishing model. So I think that that's a real point in its favor.
That's assuming that you can measure and then report back the experience that people are having with it on all those other platforms.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that the sort of visibility into people's engagement from platform to platform is obviously something that is a moving target. And I think for publishers, whether that be regarding native or regarding editorial itself, it's going to be kind of a headache, and it's only going to become more of one, but I don't think you get to ignore it. You don't get to not play. But I think, that is just sort of, that's something that isn't specific to native, I suppose.
You talked about how, at all these other publishers, you see these big, heavily staffed branded content units sprouting up, and you wonder, how are they able to make native profitable? How have you solved that problem for you guys at Thrillist?
Well,
How
so
do you bankrupt-proof native?
Yeah, well, I guess you guys are here to hear about what's next for branded content. So I'll tell you what I think is next for branded content. I think it's a greater accountability to brand lift and other kinds of brand-specific quantitative metrics for any campaign that a publisher runs. Right now, wrap-up reports vary enormously from publisher to publisher, and a lot of them rely entirely on editorial criteria and metrics that tell you that you've created a good piece of content, but maybe not a good piece of content for a brand. And maybe it didn't do anything to change what people think of this brand. And so I think as far as the thing that's going to save publishers from unprofitable native studios is this idea that just making it bigger and sexier and prettier isn't necessarily a goal unto itself. Depending on the goal that you want to deliver for your advertiser, it may be that a super expensive, rich, interactive experience is the way to make them feel like they've had a certain kind of relationship with the brand or a certain kind of brand experience, and indeed that may be the best way to achieve your goal. But there are plenty of other times that making a person have a better perception of the brand or more purchase intent can be achieved in a more straightforward and a less expensive way. And so I think by changing the center of gravity towards something that's actually measurable in brand terms, a lot of what you're seeing right now in the native space is not necessarily going to make sense because it's going to be a lot more trouble than it's worth.
So give me an example of a campaign you did that sort of fits that bill, that met that criteria, that wasn't super big and expensive.
Sure.
But move the needle.
Yeah. I mean, so for those of you guys not familiar with Thrillist, we sort of started out as a what to eat in all these different cities kind of publication. And now we're doing a lot more than just food and doing it a lot more than just sort of local contexts, but we've always been about, what to eat, what to drink, how to have more fun. And so we did a campaign for KFC when they did their hot chicken. And it was hot chicken, sort of the Nashville style hot chicken. And I think it was a limited time only, but for us, number one, we didn't have to obfuscate that this was KFC. The fact is, we're talking about a regional delicacy that you would have to get onto a plane to enjoy otherwise, and you have somebody going and making this something available to everybody. And so the fact that KFC was involved was actually part of the benefit of this thing. It was news because this was something you didn't have to go to Nashville for. And so our content around it was, a lot of stuff about Nashville, a lot of stuff about hot chicken and its heritage and kind of how it's made, the best places to go to if you're in town, but then also that KFC was doing it and what they were trying to achieve with it. And it was a really, really straightforward piece of content. But again, because we, unlike a lot of publishers now, are measuring ourselves on brand lift criteria, we needed to make it clear that it was KFC. We needed to make it readily apparent to anybody consuming the content that this was about that brand and that this hot chicken thing didn't just live dislocated from the sort of fast casual landscape. It was actually a part of it. So for us to have made it like more confusing or more immersive and less directly about what this limited time fast food offering was about actually wasn't going to get us any closer to our goals.
So did it move the needle?
It did.
And how? In what sense?
Well, so I mean,
Sell more chicken?
Yes, absolutely. But purchase intent is one of the things that we keep track of. And so when we have a brand come to us to run a campaign, the first thing we do is sit down with them and ask them, if this campaign works great, what is that going to mean? Is it going to mean better brand recall, more favorable opinion of the brand, that they'll remember the campaign, or that there's greater purchase intent? And then we go and, for every single piece of content that's a part of the campaign, run surveys against people that have been exposed to it and against a control that show the lift in each of these different criteria. And so for this one, purchase intent was part of it. And so we indeed did really move the needle as far as purchase intent around this hot chicken. And we do this for all of our different campaigns, and on average, we outperform 85% of the market with the brand lift stuff.
So you were saying that branded content is the vast majority of your revenue, of your ad revenue. So you gotta nail it.
Yeah, and I think for us, one of the things that we are trying to do right now is when we talk to brands, go and try to sort of sing the gospel of being able to demand brand impact from native campaigns. And a lot of them, it's a very natural thing because it's frankly how a lot of the people that have been in marketing a lot longer thought of it anyway before they had to sort of accept a raft of editorial numbers as a proof of success. But our belief is that if every publisher were held to these sorts of metrics, that we really couldn't be beat by anybody.
So what sort of interaction is there between your branded content staff and the editorial staff? What is the model? Is there any sort of overlap between the two? Or?
Yeah, well, I mean, when we started our branded content studio, I moved our number one employee, the guy, David Blend, who basically came up with the Thrillist voice and the whole idea of what our content was supposed to be back in 2005. He moved over there. One of my most talented editors moved over into the branded content studio. And for those guys, they are still very much involved in what's working on the editorial side, because from where I sit, branded content is really hard. You basically got to thread two needles, because it's not enough that it just be editorially good. It actually needs to change people's perceptions and ideally their behaviors on behalf of the client. So the way that we look at it is, for these guys, editorial good is table stakes. You can't shift somebody's actions if you can't engage them first. And so that's really kind of where we begin. And then from there, it's the layer of the client goals and how we actually start to move the needle for them that gets added on top of just making good content.
Do you ever see getting to a point where you would have people fluidly moving back and forth between editorial and branded content, wearing both hats, for example? Why not?
Well, I think the reason why not is not as much a sort of like Chinese wall, like reactionary philosophical thing. I think it's just a question of any employee that's asked to perform two distinct roles and how much that asks of anybody. And I've had people that have been able to wear two hats and really perform against two distinct sets of responsibilities, and they've been the most talented people I've ever worked with, but I don't really see us being able to hire enough unicorns to make that a sort of way that we operationalize. So I'm not like categorically against the idea of it, but I don't think practically it makes a lot of sense.
You mentioned the branded content being hard enough to do on its own, and then editorial, of course, it's hard. I'm just curious because you made this big business change about 6 months ago where you separated the e-commerce side of the business, Jack Threads, completely. Was that, now that some time has passed, how do you look back on that decision?
I'm a little relieved. It's hard to do both things well. Commerce is really, really hard and really, really unforgiving. But I think that having been exposed to that sort of e-commerce rigor has helped us a lot and is partly responsible for this native strategy that we have now, where when you're running an e-commerce site, and I don't know how many of you guys are doing that, but it's about effectiveness and moving people down this purchase funnel, and like a fraction percentage point of better engagement and better conversion is the difference between making your number and missing it. And that idea of like measurable effectiveness is really what our whole take on branded content is about. And so, there are things that are pretty and there are things that are effective, and sometimes they're both, but ultimately committing to the thing that's effective is like something that I think came largely out of this e-commerce rigor, where if it's not effective, you're gonna fail.
We have just another minute. Does anybody have any questions for Adam?
This was great. Do you use the terms native content and branded content interchangeably? Is there a difference between the two? And if so, if there is, if you see them as two different things, and there is a difference, how so?
Good question. I guess I think about when I think about what we're creating on behalf of clients, I think of it as branded content. Native content, I feel, is almost a broader category of just anything that seems like it belongs where you find it. And so, I think it can be much more than content, but I think that idea of native content is almost more of a hurdle that you've got to be able to cross with something that you're putting in place. And I think, getting back to what you asked about this being about a distributed publishing model, I think you can put out editorial content that doesn't feel native if you're putting it into the wrong platform and it's a tweet that's in Facebook or what have you. So the notion of nativity goes well beyond the sort of paid, not paid consideration.
Great. Well, I think we're out of time, Adam. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. Thanks.